Hey everybody, Jay here with a bit of a public service announcement. We wanted to let all of our loyal listeners know that the Agile Uprising is co-sponsoring the upcoming 12th annual Give Thanks for Scrum event produced by Agile Boston. This event is going to have the keynote speaker of Agile's own Jeff Sutherland with a QA panel in the afternoon, and as well as a host of other speakers and presenters. This event runs at 9 a.m. to 4 p.m. on Tuesday, November 24th, and of course it is online. For more information, including tickets, please go to www.agileboston.org/give-thanks-for-scrum-2020. And again, we'll have a link to this in the show notes. Thanks again, all, and enjoy the show.
Hi, I'm Mike Burrows. I'm founder of Agendashift, author of 3 books, and you're listening to the Agile Uprising podcast.
Greetings, everyone, and welcome to another edition of the Agile Uprising podcast. I'm your host, Jay Hersko, and joining me today is fellow Agile practitioner and author, quite accomplished author, I might add, Mike Burrows. Mike, thank you for joining us.
Oh, it's great to see you again, and fantastic to be here. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So we had Mike on the show because I recently, funnily enough, in a funny chain of events, I finished Peter Merrill's X-Scale class, and he talked a lot about Agendashift. So I went out and bought Right to Left, and I read it over the course of a Saturday, and I thought to myself, oh shit, I got to get Mike on the show because my mind was totally blown. For those of you that haven't picked it up yet, we will put a link in the show notes. It's subtitled The Digital Leader's Guide to Lean and Agile. And truth be told, it's one of the first books I've come across in this Agile world that actually addresses directly the idea of leadership, right? In the same big picture, there is no box that says leadership. So where do they fall into this whole piece? And Mike is the first author to address it. So Mike, before we get going into the book, can we get a little bit of background about you, where you're coming from, your experiences, that sort of stuff?
I don't know how far you want to go back, but I could go back 30, 35 years. But, you know, my background's in software development. I mean, I was actually earning a living as a developer even when I was at university. Always saw myself in very technical roles to start with. You know, I worked in embedded software, aircraft simulation. Then I got into software tools. And through a series of accidents, almost literally, I found myself in finance. Kind of the opposite of where I wanted to go. You know, I saw, working for a bank would be like printing bills or something like that. But I found it actually fascinating, full of technical challenges, first of all. And then as I progressed career-wise, I started to realize that actually the people challenges of the job were just as interesting, if not more interesting, than the technical challenges. I left banking in 2009 at the height of the credit crisis. Probably the less said about that, the better. But I did go on to be CTO of a late-stage startup, actually initially founded by one of my colleagues at UBS, the bank that I work for. That actually became the case study for my first book, Kanban from the Inside. You know, I was already quite active on the Kanban mailing list at the time I was doing this job, and I was writing a lot, blogging about my experiences, all that kind of stuff. It was literally the New Year's holiday of 2013, I wrote a blog post called Introducing Kanban Through Its Values. And that's the blog post in which I came up with a system of 9 values for Kanban, and 7.5 years later, that is still the values model for Kanban. The book followed from that. And what I found in the book, I wrote about so much more than just Kanban. You know, the values were a way of integrating lots of other things, and I could talk about other frameworks, other bodies of knowledge, all that kind of stuff from a values perspective. Very pleased with the result. I think it's fair to describe that book as a Lean Agile classic now. You know, it's sold well. It's got a mention in Wikipedia, which is always good, and so on. And that's how things were for a while. And then, something interesting happened. After some time, in the months after the book was released, there was a set of bullet points at the back of the book, as often is at the back of a book. And I and others independently, curiously, realized we had the basis of an interesting assessment tool. And here in the UK, I did several iterations on it, and I collaborated with a friend of mine, Dragan Jozic. And we kind of took all the jargon out of it, made it less and less about Kanban, made sure that it covered as much of the Lean Agile landscape as it could. Still describe what we ended up with is something that describes how these kinds of values get manifested without trying to sell particular practices. And one thing led to another. That became the basis for a small workshop, and I started to use it in private engagements. And then I productized it so that other people could use it online. I mean, emailing Excel spreadsheets around is just the worst way to do an assessment. And then I started to develop a model for how you should actually use it. And I realized that I was exploring what we then called change management in quite a deep sort of way. And I realized that this is started calling it values-oriented change or values-based change. That didn't quite stick, didn't quite work. And, eventually we settled on outcome-oriented change. And at the same time, I sort of experimented with things like clean language and Canevin and did, remarkably found how I could fit them together. And so I went through another generation where we had this model that we still thought of as change management, but it was based on a sort of very interesting and modern set of tools. And then we've been through another iteration more recently where actually realizing the tools are a lot less interesting than the patterns that we plug those tools into. And also in conversations with people like Daniel Mesic and others, really emphasizing, the issue of engagement and the disengagement that results from when, change is imposed on people. And I've started to position Agendashift as an engagement model. Mm-hmm. And it's funny, a couple of years ago, if someone had said Agendashift isn't a change management model, I would have been offended. And now I think you could, change management for cultural challenges, adaptive challenges more generally has, I think, been a disaster. The track record has been appalling. Different figures from different studies, but such a high proportion of change initiatives fail. And you think about what harm that does to people. And so I've just gone all in on outcomes and all in on engagement. And it's kind of people are saying, oh, this seems so timely, and it sort of, it's how I want to work, or it's how I do work, and so on. And it turns out that I'm scratching an itch. I'm putting words to things that people hadn't quite themselves, well, it took me long enough, but the other people haven't found the words for, and so on. So kind of there's a bit of a loop going on here. I wrote Agendashift knowing that I didn't want Agendashift to be a book about Lean Agile techniques and frameworks and stuff like that. That would cloud the message. Mm. And I wanted the Agendashift book to be very much about change, about engagement, about transformation, all those things. But a new paradigm for that. Not the framework rollouts, not change as project, all that kind of stuff.
Mike, I think is one of the things that we all see, that we all complain about, is we talk about, every practitioner I've ever talked to, when they talk about a transformation, right? Organizational change, it's always approached like a project.
Yes.
So,
yes.
and you use the word before, jargon, right? Yes. And as soon as you say that word project, there's a semantic heaviness that comes with it, because people already they've created the box in their mind. Yes. I know what I'm going to go with, and I'm doomed to fail.
I should tell you the struggles we had with the word transformation. That's something that
Oh, that's another one.
That's another one. And the way I got around it in the end in the book is I used the phrase continuous transformation. I tried to, there has to be some fundamental change happening. And is there a better word than transformation to describe that? I'm honestly not sure that there is. But we have to get away from the idea that transformation is a project, and so continuous transformations in the title. So anyway, I realized I had to write another book to put all the Lean Agile bits. I couldn't talk about an Agendashift. So that's where right to left came from. And it's really attacking is the wrong word, approaching the whole Lean Agile landscape from the perspective of needs and outcomes. And, I found it helpful. Other people found it helpful. It's a shorter book, an easier to read book than the others that are very much aimed at practitioners. And it's a book in the end. Some people have bought it by the boxful to give away to people at work, which has been wonderful. And through writing it, it's also taught me more about Agendashift. So I'm now working on a second edition of that. So we're doing a cycle thing
You
going
become a Stanley Kubrick who's consistently going back to reevaluate his
something like
previous
that. Yeah,
work.
I mean, I'll be honest with you. I think Agendashift is the book I'd like to be remembered for, but I don't think I'll be remembered for the first edition. But I'm going to do my absolute best with the second edition. I'm so excited about it. Yeah.
I will say that just being remembered is a case for in and of itself, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So one of the things, again, going back to use the word jargon, right? One of the things I noticed very quickly about the book is it's not jargon heavy. So,
Yes.
and that's why I went into an Agile Slack that I'm in. I went into our Discord server and I kept saying, hey, everybody go pick up this book. Especially, I said, if you know someone who is a leader, who is dipping their toes in the Lean Agile water, get them a copy. If we can shoot it out of a cannon at people, I think we should try and do that too, because it approaches it in a way where you're walking people through the actual thought process without walking them through the thought process, right?
Yes.
We were talking before we started recording. I just sat in one of your class with Lead with Outcomes, and you had a one-liner there which I wrote down, which I thought was really insightful, where you said clients defining Lean Agile in their own terms without the jargon is cathartic. And I thought about that, and I thought about, we're going to use the T word again, every transformation I've ever been through, right? We approach it like a project and we run it through, but we never stop to say, okay, what does that mean to us? And you come up with a very, very thorough definition. Again, that's not jargon or gunk, garbage language heavy,
Yeah, I mean, the one from Agendashift isn't even a definition. It's an image, it's a picture. And we're using, I didn't know this when I was writing the book the first time round, but I certainly know it in the second edition, and I'll make it very explicit. We are using the tools of dialogic or generative organization development. We're encouraging people to reflect and imagine what things could be like. Try to identify the obstacles in the way of that, and then the outcomes that are realizable if we can find our way around or through those obstacles. And what I've done is turn that into a repeatable process. The cathartic moments is for organization. I mean, even a non-technical organization. In the example I quoted, asking for more and more time just to reflect on this thing and to enjoy it. That was a wonderful moment for me, obviously. But people haven't had a chance to imagine what work could be like, and giving them permission to do that and have conversations about it and to create something all their own is a really powerful thing. And so it becomes not about selling tools and not selling anything. You're helping them to imagine what things could be like, and they're already ready, motivated to help bring it about. Now it's I know just is a very dangerous word, but now it's a question of how.
Right.
And that is that what makes it so different from traditional change management. I mean, most change management frameworks, when you look at them, they start with either a particular problem to be solved, a particular solution to be rolled out, or something a bit more nebulous that's a bit between the two that's called the change. And there's just a whole load of conversations that aren't happening at the beginning of the process. And the worst of it is the framework rollout, where the framework was chosen on the golf course, and now it's going to be imposed on people that didn't ask for it. And I can't accept that.
Yeah, we'll touch on the framework one in a minute, but I did find it amusing how, first of all, I appreciate you talking me through how you got to your third book, because you talk about in this book that, I've written 3 books and this is my third, but you should probably read them in the reverse order. So now I understand where that's coming from.
Well, I do everything backward. That's why it's called right to left.
And I really appreciate, like you said, a lot of times we start with the problem statement. And what is the cause of the problem, and how do we fix the problem? Where very quickly, in the book and in your Agendashift stuff that I'm familiar with, you real quickly want to go to, let's go to the outcome. Let's go to what what we really want to see.
It's actually even worse than you describe. And we like to think we talked about problems, but we jump so quickly to the solution that I don't think we even really understand the problem. But actually, I don't worry too much about not understanding problems. Once we have an idea of how we want things to be, I think that gets so much more healthy. And there's ownership of the outcome rather than the solution. Or the worst thing to happen is where the implementation of the solution becomes the outcome. And actually now you've got an organization that's lost sight of what it's there for. And that's massively dangerous. Yeah.
And that point segues into what we were talking about before we started recording was the whole idea of the consultant comes around the corner, the highly paid consultant comes around the corner and sells us on a framework out of the box. Yep. And yes. I mean, we could go on probably for hours, but the assumption that my problems are not unique, they're the same as everybody else, and if I just apply this framework to it, I'll be good to go, is a story that we see happen time and time again. And like you said, there is a downside to, you were touching on unsuccessful change. The people impacts to an unsuccessful change, right? Once bitten, twice shy. Oh, great. Another memo, another framework. And you know, we were talking before about the visceral reaction a lot of practitioners have to SAFe as a whole. And I don't think it's a reaction to the framework in itself. It's a reaction to the people who show up and sell the framework as a solution to a problem that they don't even know what it is.
Yes, I mean, I completely agree with you. I mean, sometimes it's taken me multiple years to find the right terminology for things. I mean, there are some people that think quite similar thoughts to me that describe themselves as agnostic, for example. Mm-hmm. But I think if you ask them, what do you think about SAFe, and they say they're agnostic, I think I'd have a really hard time believing them. I mean, everybody has an opinion about SAFe. Right. But I think most opinions about SAFe, you know, if they're about the technical detail or about the size of it or anything else, actually tend to miss the point. I mean, you know, I think you look at the two extremes, and it's quite a good way of, seeing the nonsense of it all. You know, if you're a practitioner and you can't find something of value in SAFe, something to learn from SAFe, then honestly, I think something's wrong with you. I begin to doubt if not your professionalism, at least your curiosity.
Right.
On the other extreme, if you think that it's okay to go into organization after organization imposing it on people, then again, I would actually call your professionalism into question.
Right.
There's a whole lot of things not happening there that absolutely do need to happen. And I'm going to stress, I'm not anti-framework. I'm against the imposition of frameworks, and I think what I actually am is a pluralist. When you understand frameworks properly, and you understand how much power there is in smashing them together and seeing what happens, and encouraging people to be creative with them, and so on, and suddenly it's a lot more fun, and rather than this painful rollout project that we've got to go through.
Right. I think to me personally, we did a whole series on the frameworks, and the biggest thing I took away is they really are just basically bags of tools. They're toolkits. And like you said, you should be able to look at the same big picture and go, okay, I want to use that, and I want to use that, and I like this idea from Les, and I think some of the discipline agile stuff, I can apply that here. It really becomes it's more like a balanced meal, for lack of a better term, right? Well, like if you're only eating carbs, you're going to end up my size. Whereas if you're, I'm a man of larger carrots. I think everybody's seen one of these videos. But if you eat more balanced meals, it's a much better end result.
And what's really fascinating is just how exciting, it's like, you throw these things into the great model collider and you see what flies off. I mean, I have enumerated the number of different ways in which just Scrum and Kanban can combine. I mean, two quite small things. But I started tweeting some of the different ways, and I sort of lost count at 10 or 12. It's Kanban inside Scrum, Scrum inside Kanban, one in parallel with the other, and so on. At different levels of detail and all these different organizational scopes, for different sizes of thing and so on, and the list goes on and on and on. They solve very different kinds of problems, and when you understand that and you have a problem that one of these things can solve, then you'd be foolish to ignore it, really.
Right. Yeah. But I think to your point, it's most large-scale companies, most organizations, most people, they want to get right to the solution. Like you said earlier, they don't want to slow down to take the time necessary to figure out what is the exact problem we're trying to solve, because, it's the whole, if I had a hammer, everything looks like a nail, that sort of thing.
So slow down. I mean, how long does it take to have a few conversations in the context of a rollout that might take 3 years? I mean, it's just ridiculous, really.
Right. And to that point, right, if you use your example for a 3-year transformation, right, or a 3-year effort to make a fundamental change in how a company works, what's 3 months in the grand scheme of things? Just having those kind of conversations, just, throwing it up on a wall and all agreeing that, yes, that's the way we're all going. It's kind of terrifying if everybody's going in different directions. So one of the things another one of the one-liners you had in the book, which I actually have it written here on my whiteboard now, is until demonstrated otherwise, most failures are failures of collaboration. And I read it, and I was sitting outside. Truth be told, I might have had a couple of beers as I'm reading it, and I sat there and I'm going, huh. And then I took my phone out and took a picture, and I sent it to a bunch of our listeners who I correspond with. I'm like, hey, check this out. Mike Burrows nailed it in one. And they're all like, holy shit, are you going to get him on the show? But I mean, it's truthful, right? Like if you, back to what we were just talking about. We want to blame the framework, blame the leadership, blame this, blame that. It just comes down to lack of people talking to one another.
Yes. And some of those are leadership failures. Some of those are, I'm not sure if fault is the right word. Many of these things are kind of cultural.
Mm-hmm.
I think the example I used in my first book, and I may have used it again, was, when I ran a big department at UBS, a global department at UBS, and they had, some strong engineering principles, and they used code reviews and things like that. And I got so frustrated with the fact that code could sit for weeks waiting for a code review. And then then the code review would happen, and then the code, the developer who wrote the code had to then go and do some rework and so on. All those weeks of delay for the sake of a conversation.
Right.
And now we know we can turn the dial up to 11, and you get pair programming and all the rest of it. And the need for the code review goes away. But I learned that so many problems that we encounter are for the lack of people not talking to each other. People sit on problems for too long. They don't ask questions. They don't escalate when they need to. They don't, they're not, proactive about things and so on. And these just become normal. Those behaviours become normalised. And I made it clear to my teams at UBS that the senior person in that relationship was responsible for that happening smoothly and quickly. And I wasn't blaming the developer for a piece of code taking too long. I was actually going to blame the reviewer, if I was going to blame anybody. That changed things around. I got a few examples of things like that where we just institute some conversations and see what happens. I mean, I kind of discovered validation same kind of way. I got very frustrated with stuff going out that nobody used, and I said, right, at the end of this piece of work, you, the customer, and you, the developer, are going to have a conversation. And you, the customer, can confirm back to the developer how it is meeting your need and adding value to you and so on. And lo and behold, the whole development process was amazingly transformed. I mean, I did it because I was cross. But, the impact of that, small thing, that one conversation was incredible. I've seen other examples where, a Three Amigos conversation has made a massive difference. Simple things.
Right.
But they get people, those kind of conversations create different kinds of expectations, and that's something I've realised. There's something interesting to dig out there, and there'll be more of that in the second edition of Agendashift. If you want change to be happening, if you want learning to be happening, if you want experimentation to be happening, there must be an organisational expectation that it's happening.
Right.
And if you don't have the right feedback loops in your organisation, you're not creating that expectation. Is it any wonder, therefore, that most continuous improvement initiatives run out of energy very, very quickly?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. The most successful one I was on was 18 months. And right at that 18-month mark, we started to realize that the things we were trying to improve became constraints that were much larger than our, environment of control, much larger than I can actually pull a lever and get something. Yes. So we decided to just
So there are some hints of it in the last couple of chapters of Right to Left, but I'll be going seriously at that question in the second edition of Agendashift, and it's a fundamental question of organisation design in the end, and I'll be drawing on some of the deeper theory and so on, and it's how we get people interacting has a profound implications for organisation. I think Agilists have known this for a very long time, but applied it mostly at team level. And we need to start getting smarter about applying some of these ideas, some of these patterns at higher levels, and achieving more profound organisation-wide change.
And great segue. Towards the end of the book, like the last two chapters are the ones that ring out to my mind the most, and it started with the titles, right? It's outside in and upside down.
Yes.
So when you just scan the table of contents, like, well, what are you talking about? But if you take a pause and you think about it, outside in is the way we should look at what we do, right? It's from the
Yes.
customer looking in at how we act. And
Yes.
then, which I thought was really, really fascinating. And then the whole inverted leadership pyramid, right? Upside down. So you're not at the top of the totem pole. You're really at the bottom, making sure that the top still works. And that, fundamentally, I honestly think, Mike, and I'm sure your experience would agree, that's kind of lost on some people.
Yes.
It's kind of lost.
It's interesting. I think outside in chapter was the easier of the two to write. Outside in strategy, I think, is a really important thing. Under recognized, that's not a new idea, but under recognized. I mean, a lot of people think that, looking at our capabilities and where we should develop them is enough of a strategy, and it just isn't. I mean, you've got to understand, kind of where you want to occupy and how you're going to get there and who else is trying to get there and all those kinds of things. And that's true even for internal, even at the level of, departmental strategy or whatever, you might be outsourced. If you're serious about your viability, about your independent existence, you ought to have a strategy for how you're going to serve your customers and meet the needs of the rest of the organization around you, and so on and so on and so on. And the outside in service delivery review, that was easy to write because I've done it, I've practiced it, and I now just polished up something, something that works, but is an eye opener for many people that have not gone beyond, show and tell, retrospectives, and things like that. The upside down chapter was really fun to write, but also harder. There's a whole melting pot of really exciting things out there. Servant leadership, open space, sociocracy, leader, team of teams, all that kind of stuff. And actually, there's definitely connections between all of them. I mean, I could take any two of them and find a connection between them. Writing a chapter that actually was coherent was more of a challenge, but I hope I succeeded. Many people actually told me that the last two chapters are the ones they enjoyed the most. I think the first four chapters are what they absolutely have to be there, and they're good chapters if stuff is new to you. But the chapters are going to have the most challenge and interest for someone who's already familiar with the frameworks and everything else will be those last two chapters. I've had that feedback a few times. Especially
a leader, right? Like, and I think of some of the transformations I've been part of where there was a leader who was kind of interested, who was like, okay, explain this agile stuff to me. And like you said, those first four chapters are paramount because you talk about, you define lean in the context of you start off with defining the whole idea of what is digital. Right? Like, because that's another word that has semantic collapse around it. Oh, well, that goes over to our digital department. So what does that mean? You know what I mean? So you talk about that, and then you talk about working to define lean, then working to define Lean Agile, and then you bootstrap it all together, and those chapters flow in a way that you're logically walking down a path to understand. I'm just building. It's like a Lego set, right? You start at the bottom and you build your way up. At one point, you end up with the patterns, which I had a long conversation with Ryan Lockard, a good friend of mine. He was talking about how we've all become patterns nerds in our lives. Like, because when you take a deep breath and you take a step back, you realize a lot of what we do, it is all pattern and pattern language. But you talk about the 7 key patterns that best exemplify like Lean, Agile, and Agility, and iterated self-organization around goals, which ties to Scrum. And then you have explicit attention to flow, which ties to Kanban. And I'm not going to drain the whole list, but you quite effectively explain, here's the Agile thing that we know, but here's why it's important in layman's terms, which bolts it together in a way that, I can get the light bulb.
That first one also goes right back to the introduction of the book as well. Iterated self-organization around goals is one of 2 ways of looking at Scrum. It's the outcome-oriented version of Scrum as opposed to the backlog-driven version of Scrum. And I think the backlog-driven one is the one that's most often explained and the most often practiced.
And most often
it's also the one most prone to dysfunction and being a mediocre process, mediocre experience for the people doing the work and delivering mediocre results because it has so little time for meaningful goals. That's what that brings meaning to the work as well as value to the customer. Time for strategy, all those other kinds of things. I make a very deliberate contrast there. I mean, right from the introduction of the book, and then I bring it back again in the Scrum context in chapter 3.
You loop through that stuff you loop through those same concepts repeatedly, which helps actually help it set in.
Yes. I start with a metaphor. I mean, it's I've used this on the conference platform so many times. And you could explain Lego to a Martian. So, do you start from the left with plastic granules arriving at the Lego factory, or do you start with from the right with children playing with the finished product? And everyone shouts back, from the right, finished product. I mean, nobody starts from the left. And then right. Explain Agile. Do you start from the left with backlog items in Jira, other tracking tools are available, or from the right with, rapidly evolving software that's beginning to meet people's needs, people collaborating, all those kinds of things. Everyone agrees that the one on the right is the right one, the right place to start, and yet you read so many descriptions of Agile that start from the left with backlog. And I'm not exaggerating when I say that I think that view of Agile is actually killing Agile. The drip, drip, drip of describing an Agile in terms which project managers will understand. I'm not saying anything disrespectful to project managers, but what we're failing to do is to convey the paradigm shift that Agile should be. It's a completely different way of looking at how we work. And if we keep using the frame, the old frame, then people aren't going to recognize the new one. And that's why, so often it gets lost. I mean, all the hating on Agile we get at the moment is from, all this push from the backlog, and people overburdened, and people not finding the meaning in the work, and all these kinds of things. Now, you and I know that it shouldn't be like that. It doesn't have to be like that.
Right.
And yet that is experienced for too many people. I think that's something that the Agile community needs to take some responsibility for, and needs to understand how it's happening. It can blame certain things like certification and things like that, but that's kind of an easy scapegoat and doesn't solve the problem. And we need to start explaining it better. Yeah.
And to blame the shirts and certs movement, right? I should trademark that. I use that all the time. I always go back to it was an old Bob Martin rant where he talked about how Agile really came into the ecosystem, right, and exploded when the project managers got a hold of it. So you can almost kind of think of it as the original sin, right? The PMs took it, ran with it, said, CSM, we got to do Agile, but they're coming from the left, not coming from the right.
Yes.
You mentioned how you start with the analogy, and you do something. I got to give you credit. I give some great analogies in the book. In the chapter around, I think it was the patterns and frameworks. You start to describe lean startup, and this is the best way I've ever seen lean startup described. Actually, I highlighted it to make note of it. If DevOps is Agile reimagined by engineers exposed to theory of constraints, which is a brilliant way to think about DevOps in and of itself, Lean Startup is the same, but by product managers and entrepreneurs with an interest in Lean. And that was another one where I read it and I put it down and I went, huh. I took a picture and I started emailing it to people like, look, Mike Burrows, here we go again. Like, you guys got to read this book. You got to listen to me. That analogy, I mean, when you hear Lean Startup, right, again, semantic diffusion. I mean, everybody has a different thing. And you explain it in a way where it ties all those pieces together, but not so tightly coupled that you can't take a second to let your brain kind of pull it apart and say, okay, and then put it all back together.
Even the digital context is actually really important here. We've always had user testing and so on. But the last 20 years, we've just had an extraordinary opportunity to understand the behavior of our customers, when we're doing things digitally. And you can think of Lean Startup working back from that. What is the learning that we would like to arrive at? What can we measure that will deliver that learning? What do we need to build that will deliver those measurements? And that's a sort of right to left description of Lean Startup. We're doing that a lot. What sustains it is that the people that are doing that are people who are really trying to steer the company as a whole. It's the company's search for viability. So the problems I described earlier are much less. The problems are solved there because it's all that if you can call it an improvement cycle, is properly integrated into the strategy, delivery, development of the organization as a whole. And that's kind of where we need to get to elsewhere. So it's understanding that, we talked about continuous improvement running out of energy. PDCA isn't a perpetual motion machine. And it's understanding where these things do sustain themselves, why is that? And how do we make sure that how do we install those in other places? without that installation being itself something brutal. You know, so yeah, there's quite a lot of subtlety to that last chapter, right to left. You know, looking at things like sociocracy and so on, starting not by changing the organization, but looking at it differently.
Right. I always think of Dave Snowden, where he talks about if you really want to make a change in your organization, hire a cultural anthropologist. And,
Yes.
and when he says that, everybody's like, what? But if you think about it, somebody who can come in and look at it from outside, right? And that's why I understand when you said that was the hardest chapter to read, because there is a lot of things there that in the Venn diagram of all those things, they do overlap in rather interesting ways. You know, you bring up David Marquet, like you said, sociocracy, open space. I start seeing all these things, and all I can think about is, we got it. Mike Burrows is the last day in Bossa Nova, you know, the Uta Eckstein, John Buck thing, where they combine beyond budgeting, open space, sociocracy, and agile. I'm like, okay, well, Agendashift for outcomes.
Well, I got John Buck to write the foreword.
Yeah, he did. I like. We had them on. That was I wish there was more visibility into their idea, because I think it's almost the unframework, right? Because it's just taking the ideas that make sense. If they make sense for you, lop it all together. Sociocracy.
You can think of sociocracy as like an operating model for your organization, but there are gentler versions of it. You know, so you can use it as a lens on your organization. You can start looking at the intersections between groups of people and realizing what opportunities there are for growth in those intersections. You know, for mentoring people. You know, for example, for better connecting different groups of people and so on. I found that really, really helpful.
And it's one of the, again, we come back to, it's the people thing. It's not the pattern. It's not the process. It's not the tools. It's so much of people. And you know, we started out talking about how people, you know, have bad change management initiatives. They blame the frameworks. They get frustrated. I had a good buddy venting the other day, an agile coach, and he said, you know, it's always people. The frameworks don't fail. It's the people, because we don't set them up to go the right way. And we're all having these epiphanies. And yet you turn around to some account manager from a big four consulting firm, and he's walking in the door and saying, hi, Mr. Burrows, my name is Jay, and I think you need SAFe. And then here we go. And then it's the solution in search of a problem.
I think it's, is it Jerry Wingberg who said, you know, every problem is a people problem?
Yeah.
It does come down to that. Yeah.
So I do want to touch on Agendashift Volume 2. Now, we are going to have you back on when the book comes out so we can talk in more detail. But like you said, and you actually mentioned it in the course that we took, where, you know, you wrote the book and then you started putting it more and more into practice. And then you came to realize that as time has gone on, you have even more support for some of the ideas that you were presenting, some of the things that you've approached. You actually have more of, I hate to say case studies because it sounds so clinical, but you have further agreement that what you're proposing is actually working. Can we talk a little bit about that, Mike?
Yes. I think one thing I did know, you know, even in the first edition, but didn't have quite the right words or tools to make the most of it, was that there's definitely some similarities between the first and second chapters, discovery and exploration. You know, one is at a high level, one is at a much more detailed level, but the kind of steps that we go through are quite similar. But what I didn't do a great job of was kind of identifying the pattern and giving it a, you know, catchy names and all the rest of it. So now, I mean, you've been on Leading with Outcomes now. You know, it's all about the I-Do pattern: ideal, obstacles, outcomes, and we keep coming back to that. And you can do it simply, and it's a linear thing, you know, from ideal to the obstacles in the way of it, and then to the outcomes behind the obstacles. But then you start to realize that it's all fractal. You know, in front of every outcome is an obstacle potentially. Ask the why is that important question enough times about an outcome, and you'll perhaps get to an ideal. You know, or even just then what happens, you'll get to an ideal. So you know, there's a really nice you know, fractal quality to it all, and helpfully also, I think, you can relate it to, you know, coaching patterns and things like that. So the GROW pattern, for example, and that's the pattern by which I understand all coaching patterns, you know, goal, reality, options, way forward, or however you want to spell out the acronym. You know, a lot of coaching things are very focused on, well, what's your next thing going to be? What's the commitment that you're going to make? And then you kind of step back a bit from that with Toyota Carter, where it's kind of, there's an acknowledgement that between where and where you want to get to, you know, you're going to go through a bit of pain. You know, you're going to find some obstacles. We don't know what they are yet, but through a series of experiments, you'll get at least in the direction of your destination, if not get there completely.
Mm-hmm.
With the I do pattern, we're stepping back even further. We're sort of looking at the whole, modeling the landscape that pathway actually lives in, and realizing what kind of other strategic choices do we have, and recognizing that, in an organization that's big enough, there's always more than one thing going on at once, and things can converge and align, and all these
Mm-hmm.
other good things. Properly identifying the pattern is also not just helping explain the tools, but it's also helping explain its purpose and when you would want to use it and when you would not want to use it as well. When is it more appropriate to be more plan oriented or action oriented or whatever. So that's some of what we're doing. That's the first couple of chapters of the new book. The mapping chapter is going to be a lot more fun because we've discovered some more funky tools. And they're kind of the opposite of clustering and dot voting, which is what everyone seems to want to do when they get lots of stickies. And instead it's sort of, pulling and stretching things in different directions, finding extreme examples, and sequencing things between those extremes and so on. And what each of these different operations does is create an opportunity for a conversation, and it's a bit like, with a story map, when you're sorting things in a column in a story map, to properly compare two items to decide which one goes before which, you've actually got to have a conversation about what they actually mean and how important they are and how difficult they're going to be and all that kind of stuff. These are different tools for helping us better understand the landscape and helping us make better choices. And so introducing a range of techniques. I mean, none of them really my invention. We perhaps repurposed some things. So the Cynefin 4 points exercise we introduced as option relationship mapping. We deliberately don't mention Cynefin until after we've done the exercise because this spoils it. Option relationship mapping is kind of based on Wardley mapping. We kind of do it backwards. So Liz Keogh and Carl Scotland, to give them full credit, came up with this last year. It was my favourite innovation of 2019, this option relationship mapping. It took us most of the year to give it a name. I'm very, very fond of that tool. And then pathway mapping is essentially story mapping with outcomes. And you can see the relationship there. A user story ends with an outcome. So a story map made of outcomes isn't too crazy, but what we have across the top isn't really a user journey. So it's we call it the pathway instead. But it's very clear where it comes from. Wouldn't pretend to hide that. And then the later chapters are all about that. How do we get that focus on change, learning, experiments? And it's the expectation that it's going to happen is a really crucial thing. And what are the implications for that for organization design is really what we're exploring at the end of the book.
And one of the things that you have in the book that you actually mentioned in the class as a kind of a side where Agendashift is a gateway drug to clean language.
Yes.
And there's a decent amount of that, which I have consistently keep coming across. I have the book. I've yet to dig into it, and somebody's going to yell at me somewhere. Somebody's yelling at their head unit right now saying, Jay, you idiot, read the book. But you do a lot of it in the course, and that whole idea of being able to speak and ask questions without, for lack of a better analogy, leading the witness. Right, a lot of your 15-minute photo method, which I thought was brilliant. I sent that to my boss. I'm like, look, we got to start doing this when we have some of these conversations, because this is why we go in loops and we don't really feel like we get anywhere. The whole idea of utilizing clean language, which doesn't force any potential solution onto the person you're questioning, is really super powerful. And I'm really, to be quite honest, I'm quite surprised we don't see more of it.
When we look at most of our questions, most of them are just laden with assumptions. And there are assumptions that just don't compute in the mind of the other person, and it gets a real stumbling block for a real conversation of curiosity. And if you are, as a coach, trying to help the client to build some model of something in their minds, and then you jump in with when you said X, did you mean Y, or have you thought of Z? You risk destroying that fragile thing, precious and fragile thing. Now, for us as asking the questions, training ourselves to remove all our assumptions from our questioning is actually really, really hard.
Very.
Learning clean language is kind of a shortcut to that. But I found, it has application elsewhere. When I'm looking at the other workshop exercises, like the outside-in strategy review described in the Right to Left book, understanding the assumptions in the questions of that review are really helpful to the facilitator, and it's actually a real good test of my own, the thought process that went into it as well. That's explored in Right to Left, and we'll revisit it in the second edition of Agendashift as well. Yeah.
I also think, we talked about how most failures are failures of collaboration. I also think there could be a second point of that where failures of collaboration, to your point, due to assumption. So personal confession, I've been going down the philosophy rabbit hole lately. I took it in undergrad. I was pledging at the time, so I vaguely remember Socrates, Plato, all that sort of stuff. But I've gotten really into the whole concept of language and what the weight that comes with, when you say a certain thing, the whole Wittgenstein argument about, I say that's a tree, but do you know that that's a tree? You know what I mean? Like, it's kind of, people look at it as kind of navel-gazing, but I also think it's kind of necessary to understand, like we talked about earlier with jargon and semantics, right? When you say a word, there's a weight that comes to that word that your assumption may be completely different than somebody else's when they hear that. So taking the time to unpack it is not necessarily the worst thing to do.
No, I mean, there are times and places for jargon. I mean, inside an organization, it's incredibly efficient if you're all speaking the same language. And this comes to another sort of related branch of philosophy. Organizations, when it comes down to it, are social constructions. Mm-hmm. If it weren't for people having conversations, organizations wouldn't exist, and they wouldn't continue to exist if the conversations were to stop. Also, those conversations can't be controlled. There are conversations happening inside and across the boundaries of the organization that no one could hope to control. So you can't completely, in the end, control the culture of the organization, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't try to influence it and do what you can to get the organization design right and so on. There are things that you should take responsibility for, but also accept that you can't control it. If you can hold those two things in balance with each other, you should do fine.
Right, balance those two conflicting. It's like the whole, it's the whole DevOps thing where, we want to operate at speed, but we want to operate in control. How do I get those two to balance? Yeah. You're absolutely right. So Mike, I know we've been on quite a bit. I have a funny feeling we could go on for quite a bit more, but I want to be respectful of your time. Like I said, when Agendashift 2.0 comes out, we're going to have you right back on. You actually made me not buy the book because I'm going to wait for version 2. So like when that comes out, I will be in touch. We'll get you back on. So in the interim, Mike, you have been offering courses. We have an episode coming up on your Leading with Outcomes course. Where can people find you if they want more information, if they want to reach out, if they're interested not only in Right to Left, but also Agendashift and some of your other stuff? Where do they go?
Yeah, I mean, agendashift.com has all of it. So links to the books, the Slack community, LinkedIn group, all those kind of things. And also an events calendar as well. I think I've just run Leading with Outcomes at a time of the day convenient to the Americas when you joined. I think the next one, the next big workshop is going to be the deep dive in November, but that's going to be quite early in the morning your time. So that's Europe morning. But there will be, I will add dates for every time zone. I kind of rotate between Europe and Africa, Asia, and the Americas, I should say. Try to give everyone a chance. We had a good number of people from the Americas and at the one you were at. We did a deep dive in July that the Squirrel North guys in Canada hosted, and we had a dozen people to that. So that was really good. So I'm definitely not going to neglect North America. There's a webinar coming up in the calendar for October, and watch this space for more events aimed at your time zone.
Perfect. Well, Mike, on behalf of myself and all of our listeners, I want to thank you for joining us. On behalf of Mike and myself, I want to thank all of you listeners for tuning in once again. You know where to find us. We have a Discord channel that is up and quite vibrant. They were arguing this morning about Atlassian's announcement that they are adding a decimal point to story points. I didn't want to go down that rat hole with Mike because we both boil over and it would be just a horrible conversation. But there is a dialogue going on in Discord. I will link to Mike's stuff in the show notes. Patreon, blah, 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 all that sort of stuff. Once again, we want to thank you all for listening. And until next time, this is the Agile Uprising podcast signing out.